All right, before we get open up for questions this afternoon, just wanted to say off the top, this time of year is always fun for us as an organization because it's the first week that we get, our players back in the building after a number of months away. And then also we're, obviously inside of a week for, our draft planning and, looking forward to next week, have an opportunity to add to the young talent base for the team. I wanted to actually take a little bit of time just to, really kind of express gratitude and thankfulness for our area scouts. Those men and women spend a ton of time throughout the fall and spring away from their families, living out of hotel rooms, really expanding their networks, evaluating, hundreds of players, and, doing deep dives into understanding who, those players are as individuals and as people. And they make a lot of sacrifices, and oftentimes it can be a little bit of a thankless job. But those individuals are truly the backbone of the operation. They're really the lifeblood of the roster, and we couldn't express our thankfulness anymore. I also would like to point out Glenn Cook and Dan Sagany for their leadership with our scouting group. Andrew Healy and Dave Giuliani for the work that they've done to lead our research and strategy group as we pull all of our information together. And then Kevin and his staff, for the work that our coaches have done throughout the evaluation process. So we are excited for next week. And with that, I'll open up for questions for you all.
Divulge all your plans for next week.
Tom, you'll be the first one to know.
In terms of priorities, there's a lot that you would like to add, I'm sure. Is there anything at the very top of the list for you?
Yeah, I would say in general you're right, Tom. It's almost like going to a restaurant hungry. Like you get familiar with a number of these players, and whether you have 2 picks or 20 picks, you probably feel like you never have enough. Our approach is more about really just adding as many young talented guys to the roster that we can. We certainly do have call it certain positional leanings. I won't necessarily disclose those specifics in this setting, but we are a little bit more long-term focused as opposed to short-term focus when we make selections when we're on the clock.
Does Sean's arrival affect your plans?
It really doesn't. Obviously we feel good about the quarterback position, but we'll really go into the weekend being flexible because you just never know how the board's going to fall. You can project and predict it as much as possible. Honestly, the past 2 years, the amount of draft capital that we've gone into the weekend with and come out of the weekend with has changed. So a lot can happen over the course of those 3 days.
Andrew, do you expect to have Baker still on your roster after the draft? And how do you see this situation playing out?
Yeah, I think, quite honestly, anything, regarding it's kind of speculation on the future or, several months out. That's probably unfair because, we realize that circumstances in the NFL change. And quite honestly, my focus has been on the draft next week, just because we're inside of a week. And all those kind of, larger roster issues or things may surface over the next 5, 6, 7 months. We'll shift my focus after that.
Would you not be surprised if he is still on your roster, if he's not here, when training camp starts?
Again, that's not something that I could, speculate or predict at this point. Circumstances in the NFL change.
Do you think the market would heat up, though, given what happens on maybe the first or second day of the draft as far as teams knowing what they have at the quarterback position?
I don't know that I could predict that necessarily, Scott.
Andrew, just to clarify, have you fielded offers for Baker yet?
I think, Nate, I'd probably never discuss, any conversations that we have on players on our roster, players on other rosters with other teams or GMs. But I understand the question, though,
yeah,
certainly.
It's a unique and fluid situation, as Kevin told us a few times the other day. Can you say whether anything's imminent, though?
No, I wouldn't comment on that with trade discussions, to be honest.
Can you address the fact that, and we talked a little bit about this at the owners' meetings, but he did come out in that podcast and say that he felt disrespected by the Browns, feeling as though you guys told him one thing and did another. that.
Yeah, Mary Kay, I think I've touched on this previously that we were transparent with our intentions with his reps. Now that being said, like I think we can all understand how Baker feels, and sometimes things in the NFL, whether it's team related, coach related, player related, they may not work out. And Baker is a competitive and driven young man who's had success as a quarterback and will continue to have success as a quarterback. So definitely understand it.
Why did you go for Brissett quickly, and what was it about him that attracted you?
Terry, I think at least since we've been here for 3 off seasons, we've mentioned we think quarterback's the most important position, and that really kind of extends to the entire room. Backup quarterback for us, will always be a priority, just because the way that performance at that position goes oftentimes defines your season, and just like you want to be insulated, whether it's through for injury or lack of availability at other positions. It really is the same thing at quarterback. Jacoby is an individual who's very talented. He's seasoned. He's played in a number of different offenses, and he's been called into action in several situations, in several unique situations, and has performed well. So he was a guy that we were excited about going into the spring, and we were fortunate enough to be able to acquire him.
You've invested a lot in the wide receiver position since taking over. You've drafted Donovan, and you bring in Amari. The 2 straight years you've drafted one. Could you just kind of maybe evaluate how you feel about that particular position group?
I would tell you, Daryl, probably across the roster, I don't think there's really any position that I just feel like we can stand pat or say, hey, we're done. And I know that may seem like a little bit more of a general answer, but quite honestly, I think that's probably how the majority of general managers, think across the NFL. You're always looking to see if you can add talent or upgrade and add players that can impact your team, and to that position specifically, impact your passing game. So we like the players that we have in the room, but we do believe in adding talent and competition where we can.
Andrew, you've mentioned in the past that you approach the draft like an expansion team. Is that harder when you do have positions like even the defensive backfield where you have a lot of really good players there?
Not so much. I mean, I'm not going to sit up here and tell you that it doesn't, there's zero factor in terms of your current roster. I think that would be disingenuous. But at the same time, because we're a little bit more long-term planning focused once we get to the draft, we're probably a bit more flexible than maybe people perceive, as we work through the board.
A lot of extensions, obviously Denzel this week. How much does that help to know that you've got that long-term planning with even players currently on the roster?
It certainly is helpful when you have guys that are under contract for several years, where you're hopeful, right, there are no guarantees at the end of the day, but you're hopeful that it's a position that is not top of mind for several years, and we're certainly excited about reaching an agreement with Denzel. So it does help with the long-term planning, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it would exclude us from taking a player at the position.
Andrew, it seems it seems that the whole Watson transaction was a bit out of character for your regime. A lot of capital invested in him. You bought at a very high price. So what merited that? Why did you go ahead and do it?
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot about how important we think the quarterback position is, and making sure that you have great performance at that spot for sustainable success and sustainable winning. Players at that spot, players at other premium spots. You'll see us get creative for potentially acquiring. So.
Well, I closed the door on potentially Jadeveon or Jarvis coming back. I'm curious, though, the fact that they're still out there, does that impact your thinking going into next week, the possibility of having that back in your mind, that you could potentially bring one or both of those guys back still?
It does not, Daryl.
Is there still interest in both of them, Andrew?
I wouldn't comment on that specifically, Tom. Yeah.
Andrew, how do you think Jarvis played last year?
I'll get to that, Dan, I promise, okay? Sorry, go ahead, Terry. Sorry,
So
guys.
how do you think Jarvis played last year, and then what impact of the injuries had and that as you evaluate him?
Yeah, I thought Jarvis was productive for us last year, and he did battle through a few injuries and toughed it out and got back as quickly as possible. I think everybody knows our affinity for Jarvis the person and Jarvis the competitor. I think he'll have a successful season wherever he ends up next year.
We've seen you, last year you moved up to get JOK. Your first time here, you guys moved up to get David. Can you kind of explain that process? I mean, you're sitting there at 44, maybe there would be an opportunity. Can you explain that process, that decision-making to maybe move up and get aggressive?
Okay, sure. Yep. So, honestly, it just really depends on, how the board falls. Whether it's, hey, is there a player available who fits a specific profile in terms of their talent, in terms of, what the projected impact may be if they were added to the roster, over the life of their rookie deal. And then, ultimately, positional scarcity and cost, right? Cost of the actual transaction to really move up or move down the board. So all those really come into play. I wish I could give you a kind of a standardized way of thinking through it, Dan. But the reality is each situation is a little bit more unique. Candidly, we spend, yesterday was our last formal strategy session. We really spend the bulk of this week talking through those type of different scenarios. Because like at this point, all the evaluation work is completed. So it's really talking through some of the different trade-offs, selections you can make at the different spots, or some of the different ways you might pivot if the board falls a certain way. So we try and get as much of that done ahead of time. I would tell you there are still things that you don't predict. JOK last year would be one of them, but you try and have a framework in place where you can work through a situation that you may not have specifically prepared for in the week prior.
Hey, Andrew, two related questions. The Malik McDowell situation, I know you want to check into that. Is there any way that he could be back here, or where does that stand? That's the first part of the question.
And what's the second part?
Do you think you're thin? I know you want to get better everywhere, but do you think that you're a little thin at defensive tackle?
So as to the second part first, we like the guys we have in the room. I think it'll be an opportunity for a couple young guys that have been here for a year or two to step up and to increase roles. Look, we will look to add. I know it gets a little bit tired to hear, but we will look to add talent, across the roster, and if the opportunity presents itself, at that position, we'll take advantage of it if it's in front of us. In terms of Malik, continue to support him appropriately, but I wouldn't get into any details regarding kind of an eventual return to the roster or anything along those lines.
Is this a deep of wide receivers class as you've seen?
Honestly, I'd say this. I think over the last couple years, you've seen a lot of young pass catchers come into the league and be successful. And I do think that that's a big part of that is just kind of the evolution of, not just college football, but youth sports. I was talking to my wife last week, and because our boys, they're in like a multi-sport clinic, and one of the things is flag football. And I was telling her, like, when I came up, that was never an option to have like a formal flag football league. It was like, hey, you're either in Pop Warner if you're going to get in at the age of 4 or 5, and it's just so different now. And I think that effect has really trickled into our game, right? Like that goes to the high schools where, when I was in high school, like, we were one of the highest passing teams and we threw the ball maybe like, 15 to 18 times a game. And now it's like, so yeah, exactly. And so I think that's kind of cool. And so now you have guys who've come into the league that, probably have, had more proficiency throwing and catching the ball than, maybe at any point recently within the sport.
How many of those guys you had in?
No, I that's something I wouldn't disclose, but it's a good question.
Have you ever been part of a draft without a first-round pick?
Good question. Yes. Indianapolis, It was actually after the Trent Richardson trade. Yeah.
Different is it? I know you do preparation on all the guys anyway, but how different does it feel? And how different do you think it'll be, Thursday night not having that pick?
Honestly, I wouldn't say that it feels much different because there's still a lot of decisions that you have to make over the course of the weekend. So maybe Thursday night in terms of the schedule will potentially handle a little bit differently, but in terms of the intensity and focus for the weekend, that really hasn't changed.
Do you feel handcuffed to move up in the second round after the Watson trade?
No, not necessarily, Tony.
I mean, you don't have any first. You only have a 2 and 2 threes. Does that make it tougher for you to move up if you wanted?
No, not necessarily, Tony.
Or would you be to move back into the first round, or how likely is that to happen?
Would never rule out anything, Mary Kay. I would say just candidly, I think it's unlikely, but I don't want to say anything in absolutes because you just never know how situations arise. Quite honestly, I wouldn't have expected us to move up last year, so you have to be flexible for the situation.
Amari Cooper's been good for a long time. What does he do best, and how has his game kind of evolved as he's gotten older?
Yeah, I think Amari is one of the best route runners in the NFL. And it's not just like a particular route that he can separate on, but just really the diversity of ways that he can get open. He's just got a really good feel for, separating, whether it's, laterally, at the top of routes or even vertically. And so I think that's something that really stands out about his game. And then, his fantastic hands as well. Catches the ball really well, and it's been productive for a long time in the NFL.
Is there a mold when you build a receiver room, like body types and things like that?
No, not necessarily. Really you look for impact with skill sets. I think, you can probably look across the league. The way that receiver rooms are constructed, or really good receiver rooms are constructed, they can take a lot of different shapes and forms.
In general, just how do you view the risk-reward of drafting a player who's injured and may not be able to play for you right away, but maybe you'd be able to get them at a spot you wouldn't be able to otherwise?
Yeah, it's definitely something that we run through. It really is, Nate, unique to the player, and that's both, the talent level, the position, and then really with your medical staff, like, okay, what is the injury? What is the prognosis for not just recovery where they're medically cleared, but also the potential short or long-term impact on performance, as well. So all of those really come into play. And I think also, quite honestly, the reality of it is, Nate, is that depending on the injury, if you're giving up a year of the player's rookie contract, that also has to factor in as well. So each situation really is unique in that regard.
When you guys got JOK in the second round, he had fallen down. You were able to get up and get him. And you guys had talked about how you had the first round grade on him and just how unique you felt that situation was, that he fell as far as he did. How unique is that in a draft where there is a guy who has that first round grade, you're not anticipating being there maybe where your pick is, and all of a sudden he's in the second round? And I know you talked about going through all your scenarios and things like that, but just how unique is that situation?
There are always surprises every year, Daryl, and that's the thing that I think, quite honestly, I've probably gained more patience with over my career, because every year you go into the draft thinking that it's just going to play out in the worst case scenario. Now, sometimes it does. I'm not gonna lie. Sometimes it does. But you go in thinking it's going to be the worst case scenario. You're going to get wiped out. And it never falls that way, because the reality of it is, if you polled everyone within our personnel research coaching groups about the board, even though we all work together and have organizational kind of priorities and preferences, a lot of those boards would look different if it's like, okay, hey, you're the one making the call. Now, multiply that times 32 teams. So as much as you think that you can project where players are going to go, and you may have a high degree of accuracy, there's a lot of variance around it. So there are surprises every year. It just becomes a matter of, are you in a position to take advantage of it? And if you are, is it worth the cost?
Andrew, to follow up on the wide receiver room question and kind of the composition of it, I know all these guys obviously have different characteristics. You're in a different position than you were earlier in the draft process with having Amari now. Are there any qualities you think could be added and beneficial to that room with the way things stand currently?
You know, yeah, honestly, it's best player possible. Like, you know, some guys, they'll produce because they're great route runners and they can separate and they have great hands. Some guys can create because they can produce after the catch with rack. You know, some guys are vertical threats. I feel fortunate that we have a really good coaching staff that will deploy individuals according to their strengths. So, long-winded way of saying no particular preference as long as they can create impact.
Considering the depth at some of these positions in the draft, could you see yourself getting more second-round picks?
Yeah, Marla, I think if you look through our draft history over the past 2 years, we've gone up and back, right? And so I think it probably more speaks to just our flexibility within the moment. Volume is always a good thing. Just candidly, that's an area where we'll probably always skew a little bit more heavily as opposed to moving up. But I wouldn't eliminate either direction.
Go ahead, Scott.
Does that mean it's a priority to add picks in 2023, especially given what you gave up in the Deshaun trade?
Say not necessarily. We've been fortunate that we've been able to add future picks in every or 2 drafts so far. It really just depends on the opportunity and then, what you may be potentially passing up. So we try our best to manage our draft capital as well as we can, but it really just depends on how the board falls and how it falls. And then, quite honestly, if we receive any calls or get any opportunities that make sense.
If we look into that draft history, are we going to find like rules and priorities, or are we going to find that every draft is different?
I don't know. I'll have to leave you guys to figure out that mystery.
Is it true what Kwesi said that you were texting him 2026?
It wasn't 2026. It was 2025.
I think there are 7 teams, including you guys, that are not going to be picking in the first round. Everyone jokes about what the Rams did in Los Angeles with all the first-round picks that they moved, and they got a Super Bowl out of it. Have you noticed a dramatic shift league-wide in how teams, because first-round picks used to be viewed like a stack of gold here, and teams now are more willing to trade those. Have you seen maybe the Rams setting this trend around the league that, hey, you know what, picks are picks, and established players are a little more valuable when you're in that Super Bowl contention mindset?
I don't know how much of the trend, and obviously Les has done a phenomenal job building that team. I don't know how much of the trend is, a function of what the Rams have done recently. I think probably have to ask each individual team what led to the choice that they made. I think probably to the second part of your question, I do think that you're seeing a shift, in the NFL. That may be a little bit more similar to what we've seen in hoops and in baseball. Because you're right, like when I first started in the NFL, and even like just a handful of years ago, it was hard. Like the trade market was a lot more illiquid than it is currently. So I think that observation is right. Time will tell if it continues, but it certainly allows for more opportunities for team building, regardless of where your roster is in its life cycle.
Do you think, Andrew, the teams are more willing to give up the first-round picks, where in the past it used to be, you even mentioned yourself, the rookie contract and that kind of stuff?
It's a great question, Terry. I think probably a little bit of an influx of more aggressive general managers as a new wave comes in. Probably different priorities in terms of positional value. Certainly probably until recently a rapidly increasing cap, so probably more activity both on the trade market and free agency. And then, also probably part of it is just, there's more turnover around organizations in the NFL than maybe there had been a decade ago. So that would really be my best guess, but I don't know.
5 years ago that there would
I'm sorry?
Could you have pictured that even 3 or 5 years ago that there'd be more of it's sort of a thing on Daryl's thing, but like to me, just saying, 17 son have a pick at
Eight.
Eight?
Yeah. So I would, 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have anticipated. 3 years ago, I probably would have been more open to the idea that the league could kind of shift in this direction.
When the Watson deal was first announced, both teams had you guys sending 5 picks to Houston, and then when it hit the transaction wire or whatever, there was a 4th round pick this year. So it's 6 total. Did something change like after the initial agreement, or what? How did that happen?
No, the only thing I could think of is like we were really kind of finalizing the deal through the weekend, but the deal that's on the transaction wire was the final deal.
I don't think I've had a chance to ask you, Ethan Posick, is that how you say his last name?
Mm-hmm.
Are you satisfied now with what you have at center, or is that a position you might be looking at there?
Never satisfied across the roster, but do feel good about the guys that we have in the room today. We think highly of Nick. We think highly of Ethan. Michael Dunn's someone who's played both spots, Yelda Froholt. So we do think we have a number of individuals that can both snap and play guard.
Did you set Amari Cooper straight that this isn't like draft day?
You know what? You're exactly right, Marlo. It's a lot calmer. I'll share this with you. I remember a couple years ago when it came out, my went saw it with my wife, and she was like, "Is that really how it is?" Like during the draft, I go, "No, I promise you, it's a lot less stressful on actual draft weekend."
Your wife, were you really doing salary cap stuff in the 5th grade?
I heard about this. This is what I get for visiting, having my wife visit her in-laws on Easter weekend. There is some truth to that. I don't know what she put out there, but there is some truth to that. We got a Christmas gift one year, me and my brother. It was like the foosball tables, but this was like it's like a hockey table, and we developed our own league, that type of thing, and built out schedules and rosters and everything like that. It's totally nerdy and silly. So thank you, Britton, for outing me on that.
Okay, so the RFA deadline is today for sheet. So what happens after today with Dearness Johnson?
To be honest, Tony, like my focus is really on the draft. We'll deal with kind of all those outstanding roster issues as we move forward. But Dearness is a good player. We anticipate him being here and everything. So we'll handle that as we get to the weeks after the draft.
Ask you one more on the Mayfield situation. His contract, how much of an impediment is that to try to move him?
Yeah, honestly, Tom, I wouldn't comment on contractual matters. Look, like I said, we'll deal with that situation as circumstances evolve.
You have an established history of dealing fairly with players. So how disappointing was it to hear those comments come from him? And now as you're going through this process of trying to find a team for him, how frequent is the communication with his representation to keep them in the loop of your efforts to, move him?
Yeah, like in terms of comments or anything, like I really don't pay a ton of attention to noise or kind of outside narratives. So that's really a kind of a non-factor. And we try and stay in communication really with all of our player reps, especially with kind of sensitive or unique situations. And this is no different.
The NFL said that it's still investigating, like Hugh Jackson said in February, and because he said that there's these end of season bonuses and he said that you were one of the people who got them. Is there anything you want to say about it?
No, I think we addressed this last week in the team statement. Again, we'll continue to cooperate with the investigation, and we're looking forward to having resolution and for them to release their findings. We feel just as strongly about everything as we did in February.